let's begin with the Jetsons fallacy. So some of you may remember the cartoon, The Jetsons, and of course, all of you know about the film Star Wars. In both those cases, notice that the world is depicted as having highly advanced artificial intelligences, but the humans themselves are unenhanced. Well, the historian Michael Bess says that this is a Jetsons fallacy. It's a situation in which we assume that AI is capable of changing the world and forget that, in fact, artificial intelligence could be capable of changing the human mind. AI may go inside the head. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. The evolution of the human brain was constrained by metabolic and environmental demands, but AI-based brain enhancement technology could augment intelligence in a way that is far faster than biological evolution. I call this exciting new enterprise mind design. Mind design is a kind of intelligent design, if you will, but we, not some god, purport to be the creators. Today, as a philosopher, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explore the idea of mind design using artificial intelligence technologies invasively inside the head. And in particular, I'm going to explore the idea of a mind-machine merger. And I'm going to ask the question, could you really merge with artificial intelligence? Elon Musk, for instance, has recently commented that humans can keep up with artificial intelligence by having some sort of merger of biological intelligence and human intelligence. To this end, a few years ago, he founded the company Neuralink that has its aim as developing an implantable chip in the head that allows data from your brain to travel wirelessly to your digital devices. There's lots of current work in a similar vein. For instance, the company Kernel. And I imagine DARPA is working on similar things. I mean, they are working on it officially for the purpose of medical therapies, but one person's therapy could become enhancement technology. And in the domain of neural prosthetics or brain enhancement, or excuse me, brain chip therapies, Ted Berger has a very well-known project involving the artificial hippocampus, which is now in clinical trials in humans to aid with memory loss. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to suppose that these kinds of technologies take off. AI does move inside of the head. And Musk himself suggests that this could be quite beneficial for the future of humanity for two reasons. First, consider the worry of technological unemployment with increasing automation and increasing sophistication of AI technology. Musk suggests that we enhance our brains in order to keep up with artificial intelligence. Further, he suggests that it's a mean for us to understand the complex workings of superintelligent AIs that we may develop at some point in the future. Well, is all of this really possible? I want to look at these questions from a philosophical standpoint, so let me start with a thought experiment that brings it home. It involves you. So I want you to suppose that it's 2040 and you're out on a shopping trip. You go to the Center for Mind Design. There, you can choose from a variety of brain enhancements. Human Calculate would give you the ability to do mathematics in a highly advanced way, like a savant. Zen Garden could give you the Zen experiences of a Zen master without needing the years of practice. And if clinical trials go as planned, customers would soon be able to purchase Merge, which allows you to gradually, through the use of brain chips in the head, to eventually just augment your intelligence and then migrate onto the cloud. So let me ask you this. How many of you would choose one or more enhancements at the Center for Mind Design? assuming that the medical technology is good. Yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to be more efficient, right? Be smarter, keep up with superintelligence, perhaps one day, stay employed. That's sort of scary. Well, as a philosopher, I have so many concerns about all of this. I mean, one thing that I'm not really going to get to today in any detail is that even though the enhancement could lead to extreme intelligence and extreme longevity even, because you could outlive your biological brain, there are worries that this could lead to a dystopia in which individuals are forced to get enhancements in order to keep their jobs or keep up with AIs, or only the rich have enhancements. And of course, there are massive privacy worries with the use of artificial intelligence and data technology today. So imagine if AI goes inside the head. But let's suppose that regulatory work is done, and it's done well, and these issues do not arise. So let's suppose that you really do have an option here to safely enhance without these sci-fi dystopian nightmares in your future. Well, in this case, I want to suggest that there are some philosophical issues you should also consider. I want to talk first, though, about what exactly it means to even merge with AI. So transhumanists are individuals like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil who think that humans can overcome their biological limitations through science and technology. And it's awfully hard to object to that as it's framed. But if you look at the trajectory for enhancement that they offer, it's far more radical than merely what the generic claim of transhumanism says. Indeed, if you look here, it says that you start with the 21st century unenhanced human, and then that person engages in significant upgrading with cognitive and other physical enhancements. And then at some point, they become post-human. They become a cyborg who's no longer even technically human. Then, as the technology progresses, and here you get to this idea of technological immortality, you could in fact even upload onto the cloud because you've transferred your neural existence into a digital one. Okay, so the idea then is that you are able to transcend your biological brain. Well, as I framed this view, notice that these transhumanists are suggesting that different parts of the brain will actually be removed and replaced with AI components. That's going to be important to my later points. Well, you might wonder, why even talk about such a speculative position? It sounds like a science fiction novel. But of course, it seems increasingly with AI technologies that science fiction can become science fact far quicker than we think. Further, I find in my experience at Washington, D.C., where I work with members of Congress and others in politics, as well as just in interacting with tech leaders, that transhumanism has become very influential. It's an influential view of the future of humanity that we see in pop culture as well, this idea of merging with our technology so that we're no longer biological beings. So is that sensible? My perspective is this. I suspect that there could be design ceilings on human intelligence augmentation. I'm interested in limits on human intelligence enhancement that aren't imposed by evolution or medicine. They are philosophical in nature. Okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about. Of course, neurotechnology will inevitably have its own limits as well. But today I'm going to look at philosophical walls on enhancement that may be there. And that should actually influence the way we think about the human future, as well as the direction we go with neurotechnology and the way that we decide we want to integrate with artificial intelligence, if we do that at all. First, I'm going to talk about a consciousness ceiling. That arises if microchips fail to underlie conscious experience. Then I'm going to talk about a self-ceiling, a point beyond which the person who attempts to enhance is no longer the same individual they were before. That individual who sought enhancement actually stops existing. Okay? This is an issue in philosophy in the field of metaphysics. Okay, so let's get started. I want to start with consciousness, and consciousness is in fact the center point of my new book. So when you see the rich hues of a sunset or you smell the aroma of your morning coffee, notice that it feels like something to be you. You are having conscious experience. Okay, you are conscious throughout your waking life and even when you're dreaming. It's that your life has a felt quality to it, which makes it so wonderful for you to exist at times, but also so incredibly difficult at other times. Consciousness is not the same thing as conscience. I remember when I first thought of these issues as an undergrad, I kind of confused them, and it's natural. So Jeffrey Dahmer didn't have much of a conscience, but he was a conscious being. It felt like something to be him, okay? So that's something to bear in mind. Now, Richard Dawkins said something very provocative, he often does, in this film that we were both on called Super Sapiens, The Rise of the Mind. He said, "It's not obvious to me that a replacement of our species by our own technological creations would necessarily be a bad thing." And I hear this a lot. I mean, you know, maybe they'll be better than us in a variety of ways, we might think. But just note something. If non-conscious artificial intelligences supplant us, it won't feel like anything to be them, right? If they supplant all biological intelligences on Earth, that would actually be a nightmare, right? AI would hardly be promoting human flourishing. Instead, it would lead to the end of consciousness on Earth. So I think it's important that we figure out whether AI can be conscious, and the first half of my book it tries to do that. I won't say I definitively proved anything, but what I did do was take a wait-and-see approach and argue that the situation is far more nuanced than the techno-optimists like Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil argue. Okay, so I want to now mention the consciousness ceiling and then move to the self-ceiling. So what if you buy Merge? Remember, at the Center for Mind Design, when you had a choice of different enhancements, the last one was the radical one, Merge, in which you gradually uploaded your existence to the cloud. Notice that if artificial intelligence isn't conscious, then merging with AI would be a terrible idea, wouldn't it? Because you would lose consciousness. So if microchips turn out to be the wrong stuff for consciousness, then a mind-machine merger can't happen, okay? And also, the robots around us, no matter how human-like they look or behave, it won't feel like anything to be them. There would be a wall on human enhancement, you see? Now, there is an important reply to this. Much of what the brain engages in is actually non-conscious computation. Only a small amount of our mental activities are actually conscious at any given time. So you might say, well, we could use artificial intelligence technologies to enhance the parts of the brain in which we don't have any activity that's conscious. So it's just that small part of the brain that underlies conscious experience that is off limits. Well, here's the problem. Both working memory and attention turn out to be key mental functions to our capacity to integrate information. But they're notoriously slow. There are attentional bottlenecks, and it's very difficult for us to even remember phone numbers. So the problem is that those mental faculties are implicated in current research as being part of the neural basis of consciousness. So if it turns out that microchips are the wrong stuff for consciousness, it will be difficult to enhance those parts of the brain through artificial intelligence. We should look to biological enhancements if we choose to enhance. But in that case, that consciousness ceiling emerges, you see? So enhancement could hit a wall, and it hits its wall because of an issue which is deeply philosophical, the nature of consciousness. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to turn to the second design ceiling or wall on human intelligence augmentation that may or may not exist. Okay, suppose for the sake of discussion that the consciousness ceiling does not arise. So microchips can be the right stuff to underlie human conscious experience. So we can swap out neural tissue with artificial intelligence components and not lose the felt quality of our mental lives. Well, even if this is the case, I want to suggest that there's a deep problem. So go back to the Mind Design Center and think about the menu of enhancements. So you have these alluring possibilities, right? I like the idea of getting Zen garden, right? So in order to understand whether you should purchase these enhancements and even seek to merge with AI, it's important that you understand what you are, okay? That is to say, it's important to think about the nature of the self, mind, and person. In particular, let's ask, what is it to even be a person? Would you continue to exist if you radically change your intelligence levels and your all kinds of mental capacities, or would you be replaced by someone or something else? To answer this question, we have to look at the metaphysics of everyday objects. So metaphysics is a key area in philosophy that studies the fundamental nature of reality. And I'll use an example. Consider getting an espresso shot, and you're standing in front of the espresso machine, and I say to you, okay, they just turned the machine off. Has the machine ceased to exist in any kind of real sense? And your answer is like, well, no, because you haven't changed anything essential about the machine. But suppose I grab my ray gun and I vaporize the machine. Well, then you're going to say, yes, the machine has in fact ceased to exist. The upshot is that some features of a thing are essential to its continuing to exist while others are not. And the big question here is, what is essential for you to continue existing? How many of you would say your brain? Seems reasonable. Okay. So I think we need to think about this before we enhance. So consider the idea that you are your brain, or that your brain is somehow essential to your survival. If that's the case, you shouldn't buy Merge, because you would have removed parts of your biological brain, so you'd be killing yourself, right? And how many of you are confident that you're not your brain and, say, nervous system? Sort of doesn't matter. You can add all kinds of other components. So only one person, you see. Okay, so the point here is that even if the technology works, in that case, the sharper mind and fitter body that you get through enhancement would be experienced by someone else. You would have ended your life in the process of enhancing. That's not much of an enhancement, right? So that's why it's important to think through these issues, because we want to avoid perverse realizations of AI technology. This is the self-sealing then. It's a point beyond which the person who attempts to enhance is no longer the same individual they were before. For the procedure causes the individual who sought enhancement to no longer exist. The problem is that the nature of the self is extremely controversial in the field of metaphysics. We don't know whether there is such a self-sealing because we don't definitively know the nature of the self. And we don't know how high or how low the self-sealing would be situated. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. So there are various theories in the field of metaphysics on the nature of the person. One is simply brain-based materialism, which says you are your brain. But another one, which a lot of transhumanists identify with, is what's called the psychological continuity view. And on that view, you are essentially your memories and your ability to reflect on yourself. This goes back to the work of the philosopher Locke. And in its most general form, you are your overall psychological configuration, what Ray Kurzweil and a lot of other transhumanists refer to as their pattern. Well, patternism is this version of the psychological continuity view that a lot of transhumanists like Nick Bostrom and Ray Kurzweil hold. And as a cognitive scientist, it appeals to me as well, at least initially. It says, in particular, what is essential to you is your computational configuration. The sensory systems or subsystems that the brain has, such as early vision, the association areas that integrate the basic sensory subsystems, the neural circuitry making up your domain general reasoning, your attentional system, your memories, and so on. Together, this forms the algorithm that your brain computes. How's that sound? Does that sound like a good view? Yeah, I see some nods. I mean, I think it is attractive, at least at first blush. But what I want to ask shortly is whether it really justifies the perspective that you should merge with AI. Other views that have been very important in these debates and in society as well, for example, consider the soul view, which just says that you are your soul. Okay? Another view that has been very influential in philosophy and also within Buddhism is the no-self view. This says the self is an illusion. There's no underlying self there. There's no survival because there's really no person. So, now that we have some of these theories in our minds, let's go back to the question, should you merge with AI? Well, each of these views of personal identity actually has its own implications about whether you should enhance your brain in these radical ways. If you're a brain-based materialist, as I mentioned, then you can't change substrates, so you cannot merge with artificial intelligence in the way the transhumanists envision. So these invasive brain chips, if they actually replace neural tissue, will actually end up eventually killing you, right, at some point. And you don't know where, you don't know at what point that will be the case. You'd be replaced by something else. So that means that neurotechnology should develop biological brain enhancements and minimal AI enhancements that do not replace or damage key parts of the brain. So there's a concrete proposal for research there based on that philosophical issue. The soul theory, on the other hand, suggests that your decision to enhance would seem to depend on whether you have justification for believing the enhanced brain and body would actually retain that soul or immaterial mind. And that's an issue for religious advisors. Okay. The no-self view says that you can't really merge with AI at all because there's no self that would survive in any case, right? There's no you. As Nietzsche puts it, the I is a grammatical fiction. Still, you may strive to enhance. For instance, you might find intrinsic value in adding more superintelligence to the universe. You might value life forms with higher forms of consciousness and think that your successor should be such an individual. Now let's turn to patternism. As I mentioned, this is the view adopted by many transhumanists. So if we have the transhumanist view of the nature of the self in hand, you would think it would be easy to justify merging with artificial intelligence. Not so. There are so many problems with the view. I'll just name the key one. A key one is called the reduplication problem. So suppose you're just your pattern. If that's the case, then suppose you upload your pattern. In principle, couldn't it be downloaded to hundreds of copies of you? Maybe they're clones of your biological body. Which one is you?
right? Are all of them you? I mean, if you're asking questions about your own survival, these are life and death issues, right? It may be fun to adopt a certain perspective on things when you're talking to your friends, but would you bet your life that you could really be located in, say, 100 different spots? That's called the reduplication problem. Your pattern then isn't sufficient for identity over time. But there's a retort, and that is to say that an individual is the same person over time, not just when they have the same pattern, but also when there's a sort of space-time worm that connects them over time. So as you move throughout your life over time, you trace out a kind of trajectory through time-space, right? And so physicists talk about your life as being a sort of worm in space-time. You move over time through space. No breaks are allowed on that view, okay? So if the psychological continuity view modifies their position, saying this, that you're not just your pattern, but you're the worm you carve out through space-time, you can't survive uploading because your worm would be broken, right? And even if you took out like a third of your brain and located it somewhere else, for example, or even if you replaced your brain with microchips, that wouldn't be anything like a normal space-time worm. So what I'm wondering is how this position even justifies radical enhancements, because I would assume that if, transhumanists are suggesting this kind of route for the future of humanity, there would be some underlying coherent rationale for the position. But of course, I'm just talking about the leading kind of theory of the nature of person. Maybe they have something else in mind. For instance, the influential transhumanist Jim Hughes is a Buddhist, so he takes the no-self view. Okay, now there is a retort to this, and it is that someone could in fact still merge with artificial intelligence through a series of gradual but cumulatively significant enhancements that add AI-based components inside the head, slowly replacing neural tissue. So this is a slow kind of alteration. This wouldn't be uploading because one's thinking would still be in the head, but the series still amounts to a transfer of your mental life over to another substrate. So then, in a sense, you're still merging with AI. Well, I've already said it's a little weird on the space-time worm front, but let's put that issue aside. I think there are also some other problems here. The problem is this: where does the pattern continue, and when does it end? For instance, suppose you lose all of the memories of your past. Are you the same person you were before? Or have you started to become a different person entirely? And how would you find out whether you're truly someone who has survived, right? Maybe deleting a few bad chess playing habits through some of these brain enhancement technologies will turn out to be kosher. It will turn out to be a continuation of your pattern. But what about a serious mind sculpting endeavor, like the kind of enhancements I raised at the beginning of this talk, the kind of enhancements like Zen Garden or Merge? Where is the self-sealing? How do we know where it starts and what instances of a pattern are still instances of you? That's the question. If the self is just the mind, if the self is just the brain, you've died at some point. Okay, so you have to know the answer to this before you embark upon radical enhancement. Okay, so some upshots. From today, I'm leaving you with some known unknowns, if you will. We don't know if there are self and consciousness ceilings. If there are, you can't merge with AI. And all the money that's being spent on these sorts of technologies to go inside the head had better keep these issues in mind. People, though, who have the option for these enhancements, say 40 years from now, may just ignore these warnings if the technology does get developed, because they might not like philosophy, or they might feel secure that they have an answer to the question, what is the nature of the person? But they could be wrong, right? And if that's the case, then they will have paid money to end their own existence, right? Now let's go back to Musk's twin goals. He suggested that we should merge with AI to alleviate technological unemployment that's anticipated to happen in the future due to artificial intelligence technologies, and to keep up with the complex computations of superintelligent AI. Well, some of the humans who ignored the philosophical warnings may still be able to play this role, right? But it's still not a way that AI is promoting human flourishing. In fact, the thing to do in this situation is to make sure that the public understands the risks, which leads me to some more suggestions. But first, before I sum up with suggestions, I want to mention the cosmic import of these issues, because as the NASA chair, my job is to think about our place in the larger universe of intelligent systems, should other intelligences exist. And so there are all these exoplanets, and they're said to be potentially habitable. Maybe they're inhabited. And maybe there's intelligent life, and it survives its technological maturity. And maybe other worlds are developing their own AI technologies. If so, the issues I've raised today do not just arise for Earth. Issues about the future of intelligence, whether these future beings would be conscious or not, it impacts the understanding we have of the evolution of intelligent life throughout the universe. So again, these issues are crucial. The takeaway here, to go back to Earth, is that as AI technology turns inward, reshaping the human brain, we may actually be playing with tools that we don't understand how to use. The self, the mind, and consciousness. An insufficient grasp of the nature of the self, mind, or consciousness could actually undermine the use of artificial intelligence and brain enhancement technology. So my suggestion then, as we move forward, is that philosophy and AI and neurotechnology stay in dialogue, because often our social development lags behind our technological innovations, and it's important that we hit the ground running on these issues. And concretely, we should definitely watch the results of implanted chips as they're developed when they start to replace parts of the brain that are found to underlie conscious experience, because we will be able to tell, or so I argue in my book, that the felt quality of experience has been altered by the AI technology. So in other words, we will learn whether microchips are the right stuff for consciousness as we replace parts of the brain responsible for consciousness in the context of neural prosthetics. So already medicine is working on all sorts of chips in the brain, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, such as the artificial hippocampus. So should we begin to replace parts of the brain that underlie consciousness, we should see whether consciousness has been altered, and that will instruct us on whether microchips of that sort actually underlie conscious experience, or whether the whole idea of machine consciousness is off the table. So that's productive. I think we may actually see an answer to the consciousness ceiling issue, okay? On the other hand, I don't know how we would ever figure out the self-sealing issue. I think that is very difficult, because if you replace parts of your brain with isomorphic chips that do exactly the same thing, right? You may cease to exist, but that creature there is still functioning and has highly sophisticated abilities, and it may even believe it's you. So the answer here, the path forward in this context, is not to stop working on brain enhancement technologies. Instead, I believe we need to inform the public of the risks. So in the context of genetic testing, for example, most hospitals require that individuals have genetic counseling before getting their test results so that they understand the perils of genetic testing as well as the benefits. Well, I think, 40 years down the road, should people actually consider brain implant technologies for enhancement purposes, they should actually sit down and learn the philosophy. Okay? Because otherwise it's disingenuous of AI companies to develop the technology and sell it to people so that they can keep their jobs or keep up with the complex computations of superintelligence. And of course, all this has been assuming that the use of AI in the head still respects people's privacy and that there aren't horrible cybersecurity nightmares there. Furthermore, even enhancements that merely involve the rapid or even gradual replacement of parts of one's brain without enhancing one's cognitive or perceptual skills, those might be risky. You see? Because as discussed, the brain could turn out to be essential to the self. And in that case, you would have died. So a path forward is to perhaps seek instead a limited integration with AI, if you're concerned about these issues, through the use of external devices such as wearables or implants that don't remove existing brain tissue. But some problems still arise if you put implants, say, elsewhere. Maybe you remove the appendix and add some brain chips there or whatnot. If you radically alter your pattern, and patternism is right, you could still cease to exist. Thank you.
With all the conclusions about in the situations where we consider the brain to be dead or ourselves to be dead, why not looking at it as instead being dead, we just evolved? Like I'm not myself, I'm not the same self with yesterday's myself, I changed a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the real issue here is if you take a picture of yourself from kindergarten or first grade, and you actually are told that that person would cease to exist, the person in the picture who's you, as opposed to the rest of the class, you would probably worry that you now would not exist anymore, right? So the real question here is which changes are just changes that evolve you as a person, like ways you develop, right? Like what you major in, who you marry. I mean, these are all monumental shifts in who you are, but they are not what I've called alterations in your essential properties. So the question here is what is essential to you such that you would no longer exist anymore? And I went through several answers. I mean, one is your brain, one is your soul, one is this idea that there's some sort of psychological continuity, right? And another very important one is that there is no self, so this whole thing is just, looking for something that's not there. So I do think we have to engage with these issues, right? And try to figure out which are the scary things that we shouldn't change if we care about survival.
Is there any thinking on the development of these brain chips for animals? Because for a lot of cases in an animal, you may or may not care about its stream of consciousness if it's the same self. but there still might be some advantages to, like make a cow smarter to lead the herd somewhere. And even in this case, if it's a different cow, you don't really care.
Interesting. So the science fiction writer David Brin, I don't know how many of you read science fiction, but he writes about uplifting animals, right? Like uplifting their intelligences. So, I mean, I don't, I'm a big animal rights person, so I don't like the idea of animals being experimented on at all. And I think, I don't know of anyone doing it to change animal cognition so much as experiment on what would happen with human cognition. So like Ted Berger, before he put the artificial hippocampus in, human experiments, he used it in the context of great apes.
Okay. Yeah, it just seems that like one of the conclusions seems like if it kills yourself, it might be impossible to know if that happens, but if that does happen, you seem to be suggesting that like that puts an end to this kind of development. Whereas it seems like the natural progression is like, okay, if it does kill yourself, you still have this other alternative within animals, or like, who knows what else.
Yeah, so I just don't think that there would be much of an incentive to develop it in non-human animals if you couldn't use that kind of technology in the human brain, right? From a medical perspective. I mean, maybe
from a medical perspective, but from an economical standpoint, sure. Like
have a smarter dog or something?
Or cows, or, like there's a lot of like, then you don't have to have people work if you have a cow that can do everything, like.
Oh, I see. So in other words, animal control, like from an agricultural, scary. Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really good point. I see what you're saying now. I hope that if it is done, it's done humanely. When you look at the history of factory farming and, in this country, it hasn't been extremely humane as a practice.
I can imagine that if we did all this testing on animals and we still didn't know whether or not it kills the self of the animal, but they seem to have some, they're now an enhanced animal in some way. I can imagine a dystopian future in which that kind of technology is used on humans who have committed crimes and things like that, where, society no longer cares if this person continues to exist kind of as their self, but they may be more useful to society being an enhanced human who may not even...
Well, I think there's a problem that might emerge in authoritarian dictatorships, right? I mean, look at what happens to prisoners in China. Their organs can be harvested. And so I think if there's the possibility of creating super soldiers, and these decisions are in the hands of authoritarian dictatorships, or individuals who are smart, super smart, we absolutely have human rights worries. And so, my job is to raise the philosophical issues, which I think are actually relevant even in countries that are democratic, because they involve misunderstandings of the underlying philosophical issues, right? But yeah, AI technology, as you all know, in the hands of an authoritarian dictatorship can involve all kinds of terrible practices. Yeah.
So since I already have the mic,
Yeah.
kind of an unrelated question that I have for you is, so this point of view that Musk seems to have that, as AI systems continue to get better and better, humans may need or want to keep up with them in some way. Like in my personal opinion, it seems like it's coming from a bad place, right? Like in the 60s, Doug Engelbart and other people like that imagined these kind of symbiotic relationships between humans and machines, where you end up being an augmented human, where you're not really replacing anything in your brain. Maybe you're wearing a device or whatever, where, the fact that you're wearing a device like that, you can now do things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And so, like, in my opinion, I think that future would be a nicer one to live in than a future in which people are kind of messing around with their, innards. Or so I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think wearables, are under development. As you know, Facebook just bought Control Labs, for instance, and that is one path to integration with AI. I still think that there are privacy issues, right? I mean, Facebook's already been, selling our data all over the place and not telling us transparently. So, if AI is something we wear and that data is just collected and gathered, I mean, let's hope that AI regulations improve so that people like you can do your job without worrying about these, awful uses of the technology. You want AI for human flourishing. That's what we all want. So I think there are some concerns. But yes, that's a path in which there wouldn't be these radical worries about personal identity, right? On the other hand, I didn't mean to sound totally anti-invasive brain enhancement. I mean, it could be, for instance, that technology is capable of enhancing the brain in all sorts of ways, like through the use of biological enhancements. So, what if nanobots are capable of helping us, think better and our brains live longer? I mean, I'm very transhumanist in a certain way. Like the generic statement of transhumanism that we should use science and technology to improve our lives is something that I think a lot of us agree with. I mean, we absolutely should pursue it. But, my claim today was the invasive uses of neurotechnology. Like, should we really put chips in the head? We'd better watch out for shifts that are too radical in our personalities, especially if you believe patternism, or if the chips actually end up removing or damaging parts of the biological brain. Of course, if somebody needs a neuroprosthetic, if they need a brain chip because that part of the brain isn't working properly, that's another matter. I'm very excited, for instance, about the developments over at Neuralink to help individuals who need to communicate with digital technology who are locked in, right? And so I'm not arguing against that at all.
Building on top of the last question, or the last question you had. So in my personal opinion, there's no way that we can stop this. So the whole AI development is like unstoppable. And also as human beings, how we evolve and be here, in the first place, we have some genes from bacteria that just got into us and became part of us. And also along with our evolution, there were other like cousins of human beings. And some of them just extinguished, and some of them were like killed off by our ancestors. So my point is that if we do not do this AI stuff, some other people will kind of evolve into the AI age, right? So my question is this: if that happens, what are we going to do about it?
Great. It's funny because my daughter, Allie, who's in the audience, she and I were just talking about this when we were driving the other day. I think that's a wonderful point to raise because I think the idea that something's inevitable is often raised in the context of AI developments. And especially if you think that some other country with less of a concern for human rights might develop it, right? And it kind of implicitly causes us to think we have an AI arms race on our hands. And, what if the next domain that involves, a so-called arms race or a race for supremacy is actually us? That is, what if the brain becomes an economic commodity or something that we feel needs to be enhanced so that we can maintain parity with another country? So I think the important thing here is public education and AI regulation, right? Like I said, I don't think someone will want to enhance their brain in radical ways if they believe they're not going to survive, because most people who sign up for enhancements are doing it because they think that it constitutes survival. There are other ways that we could have a society that keeps up technologically. We don't need to throw people under the bus and have a perverse realization of AI technology. So I began the talk by talking about the nature of conscious experience. And what we really want to do is we want to maximize conscious experience. That is, we want to ensure the flourishing of conscious beings. And to do that, we need to understand whether microchips even are capable of underlying conscious experience, right? And we also want to make sure that the individual who is considering an enhancement will continue to exist, right? So I think there probably are ways that we as a society can productively move forward and use AI for human flourishing, but we just have to bear in mind these philosophical debates.
A couple of weeks ago, we had Sean Carroll as a guest who talked about quantum worlds and many worlds theory, in which case we're not talking about a worm going through space-time, but different branches. So my question is, in this case, if we merge with AI, do you think it would kill a branch? Would it add one? Or how does it work with consciousness?
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool. I don't think, well, first of all, don't get me started on the many worlds interpretation, because, I think that whole thing is rubbish, to be honest, that interpretation of quantum mechanics. But I don't think in any world, where you split, would you survive if it's the case that, you are your brain. If you are your brain, you cease to exist, right? Unless there's a world where you didn't enhance, And this gets into philosophy, because in some other universe, these parallel universes, that creature may be your doppelganger, but it's not really you, right? I mean, it's somebody who resembles you in all sorts of ways, but you've died in your timeline. This does sound a lot like, what's that film, 12 Monkeys, right? Yeah, but I love the physics stuff, and I know Sean's work. That's great that you had him here. Yeah, because I'm all over the emergent space-time issue. Super cool, but yeah, many worlds.
Have you thought of these philosophical questions you propose in the context of drugs? Because it seems to me that all of these questions can be applied to drugs. These are substances that alter the chemical structure of the brain. So you could say that if for those who believe that they're a brain, you could say that drugs, if they alter the brain, then
Yes.
kill them.
Yeah, I think people grapple with these sorts of
It
issues.
applies the same way.
Yeah. People grapple with these already, these issues. I mean, they grapple with them in the context of taking, say, psychiatric medication that they feel changes them drastically. So if they're already grappling with these issues in the context of something that may seem somewhat moderate and everyday, like taking, psychiatric medication, can you imagine what it would be like to walk into a mind design center and change all sorts of cognitive abilities? This would be potentially life-changing, right? And life-changing in a way that isn't just like life-changing when you start college, it's like life-ending, you see.
So you seem to have a little bit of a negative preconception about the pattern, continuity, train of consciousness kind of thing. So doing like a full brain replacement or an upload is one of those things that, since we can't observe the self and there's no way of proving that the self exists after this kind of operation, that we immediately, should we never pursue that train of thought? Is that something that's just completely off limits in your mind? Or is it something that we should be probing and exploring, and it's still on the table?
It's the latter. Okay. So I wrote the book for people like you, and for the younger generations who may have to make decisions about machine consciousness and brain enhancement. And I think everybody considering these issues should deliberate and understand that a stance of what I call metaphysical humility is suggested. And that means that understand that there's no easy answer to these vexing questions. In fact, these are classic philosophical issues, which if you've taken philosophy classes, you realize you can't really definitively prove something often when it comes to these classic philosophical debates, because they're very difficult. And how would you run an experiment on whether the self is a pattern? So what I want is for people to be humble in the face of this. And some people may choose to be extremely daring, and maybe they don't even really care if they continue to exist, but I want them to understand the issues.
If you can reduce the philosophical problem to the question of whether you'd be killing yourself or not, then I'd say there might be an argument that in countries where euthanasia was already legal, like people have already done the philosophical work to decide that it's okay to upload themselves. Have you thought about it, euthanasia?
That's really interesting. I mean, I think there's some issues there that are similar because it's about, the right to die, right? And so somebody who believes that they may not continue to exist, but say values superintelligence or something, I mean, maybe they're done with their time. I mean, suppose we are able to live very, very long lives, 300 years, and, we have end-of-life parties, and we decide that we're going to morph into something else, and we find that spiritually important for us. That's great. I mean, I'm pro-choice in these ways, but I think that public engagement with these issues is key so that people can deliberate with the philosophical issues in mind. Thank you.